Thank you, Mr. President, the very esteemed sponsor. I'd like to commend the good sponsor for coming up with this proposed measure. I do believe that if this bill is enacted into law, it will be an important legislation because it will expressly recognize the right of individuals with diverse sexual orientation and gender identity and expression to legal equality, which is, again, a fundamental human right under human rights treaties, beginning with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It will also provide a legislative clarity to the rights of individuals with diverse sexual orientation, or the LGBTs, as highlighted in the case of Ang Ladlad versus Comelec. So just a few questions, beginning first with the title.
Mr. President, good gentlewoman, at the outset I would like to thank my sister in the Senate for the spirit of support she has expressed for this bill, especially because one thing I would like to affirm at the outset of this interpellation, Mr. President, is that people should not be discriminated against because of who they love. So a very timely reminder to us on the eve of Valentine's Day. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, I was referring to the title, Mr. President. The current title of the proposed measure is an act prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or the acronym SOGI, and providing penalties therefore. As a premise for my question on the title, Mr. President, the Philippine LGBT Hate Crime Watch has provided the statistics that may be found online that there are around 164 cases of murdered LGBTs in the country between 1996 to 2012. Now, might the good senator be aware that adults as well as children experience harassment or bullying, and that the Psychological Association of the Philippines itself recognizes this phenomenon?
Yes, Mr. President. The hate crimes, another statistic of which is that from the 2014 Philippines Country Report on being LGBT in Asia,
yes,
which noted that 28 persons were killed because of their sexual identities just in the year 2011. These hate crimes of killing are among the worst forms of discrimination against people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity, especially LGBTs. But yes, the phenomena that the good gentlewoman referred to of harassment and bullying in various settings, including schools, workplaces, and others, also constitute forms of discrimination against LGBTs and, in fact, all individuals of whatever sexual orientation and gender identity or expression through the passage, hopefully, of this bill.
In relation to that, there is this statement from the Psychological Association of the Philippines. This was published in the Philippine Journal of Psychology way back in 2011, and I quote, "Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Filipinos continue to experience stigma, prejudice, and discrimination in Philippine society. This stigma is manifested in actions such as bullying, teasing, and harassment of LGBT children and adolescents in families, schools, and communities," end of quote. Now, Mr. President, while Republic Act number 10627, or the Anti-Bullying Act of 2013, addresses the issue of bullying in elementary and secondary schools, then we have to also look at this phenomenon of bullying at societal outcome, the bigger picture of our laws. Now, the principal author, very good Senator Riza, is a human rights advocate herself, takes strong consideration of the lifelong impact of discrimination, not only against direct victims, the LGBTs, but also against and upon their families and loved ones. So while the direct victims are the LGBTs themselves, then the hurt is also felt by the families and loved ones of these bullied LGBTs. With the end in view that our laws should be clear, succinct, and categorical, would the good sponsor consider an amendment to the title of the bill to reflect the direct rights holders of our proposed legislation? The rights holders being the very individuals with diverse sexual orientation. So in the proper period of amendments, would the good sponsor be amenable?
First of all, Mr. President, I thank the good gentlewoman for pointing out that discrimination against people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity or expression can in fact begin at the very early childhood stages of life, leave a lasting trauma on the young person and his or her families. We have cases here in the education sector, even later in life at the higher education level. Cases, for example, involving Hender Hersho, a transgender student of UP Diliman who protested when her French teacher refused to address her as a female because the teacher said it is against her religious beliefs. Or in another case, against Hart Dino, the first openly transgender chairperson of the University Student Council of UP Diliman, who recalled being told to sign a gentleman's policy. This was in a private school, a so-called gentleman's policy, which was a contract that prohibited LGBTs from, quote, screaming or putting on makeup, close quote, to any stage in the life cycle of an individual, of individuals of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, which are richly documented in terms of the economic costs of homophobia. And if the good gentlewoman is interested, I could share more about this later. But to the direct question, I would be very open to considering a proposed amendment to the title, Mr. President, during the period of interpellation. And I thank the good gentlewoman for hinting that her proposed new title would identify explicitly the rights holders. I think that is a wonderful idea. And doubly, I thank her, Mr. President, for not limiting the rights holders in this proposed law to LGBT. Although the LGBT in the Philippines, as in other countries, primarily bear the brunt of sexual orientation and gender identity or expression discrimination. But thank you, good gentlewoman, that, Mr. President, she referred to individuals of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities or expressions.
Thank you. And we thank the good sponsor for citing actual incidents of discrimination against individuals with diverse sexual orientation. I'd like to see the list that the good sponsor has collated, which makes it all the more imperative for us to further provide legislation to protect individuals with diverse sexual orientation. Next point.
Mr. President, just to quickly respond to the last comment of the good gentlewoman, I would be very glad to provide her the cases of discrimination. It is just a short list that I have here this afternoon, but part of the comprehensive documentation of gender equality advocates in the Philippines. Of course, perhaps the most traumatic for our whole country, the case of Jennifer Laude. And then cases of denial of entry to establishments, for example, involving television personality Inday Garutay in a fine dining restaurant in Pasig City, and similarly Bibi Gandanghari. And in terms of discrimination in employment, Mr. President, in some recruitment processes, trans women are told to cut their hair short and dress in men's clothes if they want to get the job they're applying for. So these are, aside from the cases I mentioned earlier, I would be very glad to give the gentlewoman.
Thank you very much. And you just mentioned clothes. And that brings me to the second point. I'd like to tackle the issue or the matter of cross-dressing, or the circumstance whereby a person born male and who identifies herself, let me use the term because that is a recognition of their human right to gender identity.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Born physically male but would prefer to be called she, her, etc., prefers to wear clothing that is commonly known as ladies' apparel. May we know the viewpoint of the good sponsor as to cross-dressing? Would this fall within the contemplation of the proposed measure, as may perhaps fall under any of the prohibited acts that is enumerated in the bill?
Yes, Mr. President. Prohibitions against cross-dressing in principle would fall under the prohibited acts of this bill for at least two reasons at the outset, Mr. President. In the definition of terms of the bill, gender identity refers to the personal sense of identity or expression as characterized, among others, by manners of clothing, inclinations, and behavior in relation to masculine or feminine conventions. Additionally, Mr. President, gender expression, which is another of the key concepts that this bill seeks to enshrine in Philippine law, gender expression refers to the outward manifestations of the cultural traits that enable a person to identify as male or female according to patterns that at a particular moment in history a given society defines as gender appropriate. And this may also embrace manners of clothing. Lastly, at this point, Mr. President, perhaps the good gentlewoman is also aware that one of the concerns raised about the sexual orientation and gender identity and expression bill is how it will relate to the issue of school uniforms.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. President.
I was about to mention
Yes, Mr.
the examples
President.
of schools or
Yes.
universities.
And precisely, schools are one of the places or one of the institutions where we would challenge our social institutions to step up to the equal value and dignity of every person and to step up in terms of eliminating discrimination. In relation to school uniforms, Mr. President, this bill is a human rights legislation that addresses the historical prejudice against LGBTIQs. It's time to remove our gender-insensitive rules that have been contributing to the systemic homophobia, transphobia, and stigma. If a rule or a policy in an educational institution, or for that matter, workplace or establishment, will devalue the dignity of another human being, it should be declared discriminatory and should be proscribed. So finally, we need to remind schools and the other institutions and persons in authority there that uniforms, for example, are done to identify to the institution one belongs to. These regulations are not imposed, are not supposed to be imposed to promote gender binaries. It's time to challenge these rules and policies, and this bill requires them to be at least SOGI sensitive.
I had to raise that because
Yes, Mr.
school
President.
uniforms as an example. Yes, meron po tayong mga eskwelahan o mga universidad na katulad po ng Far Eastern University na pinapayagan yung mga estudyante to cross-dress.
Opo.
But I don't know whether that is more of an exception to the general rule insofar as the level of tolerance that our educational institutions currently have in relation to the issue of cross-dressing. So it's very good to learn from the good sponsor that this bill, in fact, would contemplate violations insofar as schools and universities making or imposing express prohibition against cross-dressing. It may fall under any of these prohibitions, although I would certainly try to propose a clearer provision in that article or section on the prohibited acts relative to cross-dressing?
Mr. President, I would appreciate that suggestion and thank the gentlewoman for pointing out the good example of FEU as perhaps one example of programs to promote non-discrimination and diversity, particularly diversity programs and policies, within which all government agencies, government-owned and controlled corporations, private companies, public and private educational institutions, and other entities shall establish diversity programs to ensure human rights violations and violence on the basis of SOGI are prevented.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Senator Legarda.
Yes, I know that the lady, Senator Delima, has the floor. I just have to leave the floor because of another meeting in the office. I simply wanted to commit my wholehearted support to this long-delayed measure so that the Philippines can be in the forefront of protecting the rights of our
Individuals with diverse
sexual orientation. Yes, I think it should also include the way we deal with them in media. Does the bill include that? The way they are projected in television programs, in radio, the way they are mentioned in print and online as well, sometimes mocked. I will have my chance to interpolate. I just was so interested hearing the discussions of our colleagues, and I think this was actually included in a bill I had in my second term, but it was limited to discrimination against ethnicity, and there was a amendment of then Senator Miriam Santiago to include discrimination against gender and identity. Yes, so I just wanted to convey this support to our sponsor.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, to my kasimanwa from Panay Island for her renewed expression of support for the bill, and I look forward to discussing with her how to pass both this sexual orientation and gender identity and expression specific anti-discrimination bill, and also a more comprehensive bill addressing various types of discrimination, passing them separately so that they can complement each other in a package of anti-discrimination measures.
Thank you to Senator Delima for yielding the floor. But yes, siguro wag nating ihalo yung ethnic discrimination, pero importante bigyan ng halaga na walang gender identity discrimination sa salita, sa gawa, sa polisiya, at maging bukas ang kaisipan ng mga institusyon, ng pamahalaan at ng pribadong sektor sa pagtrato sa mga at respetuhin ang ating gender identity na mga kaiba sa atin.
Maraming salamat, Mr. President. Pati din sa affirmation ni ng good gentlewoman from Panay Island dun sa kawastuhan ng strategiya na ipasa natin magkakahiwalay pero complementarily yung iba't ibang basis na anti-discrimination measures. At particular dun po sa concern na ni-raise nila, sa Section 5A nga po ng bill natin, it shall be unlawful to promote stigma in media. So inaasahan ko po yung marami at mayamang payo ng gentlewoman na alam po natin ay isa sa pinaka may maiaambag mula sa perspektibang iyan.
Thank you.
May I proceed, Mr. President?
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Let's proceed to the redress mechanisms. I'm always concerned about redress mechanisms because what's the point of laying down all policies about this and also what constitute prohibited acts if there is no sufficient and effective redress mechanisms for violation of any of these provisions. This representation is, of course, cognizant that at least for women with diverse sexual orientation, we have Republic Act 9710, or the Magna Carta of women, that encompass all human rights of women. However, and I'm aware of this as a former CHR chairperson, there are instances when men with diverse sexual orientation are without clear recourse or direction in the application for reliefs when there are breaches of their rights as members of sexual minorities. Mr. President, would this bill ensure that perhaps until CHR has its own charter, something that I've been pushing, hopefully this time around becomes a reality, it should have its own charter because of its sweeping constitutional mandate to protect all human rights of all Filipinos. Is it clear to us under this proposed measure that men with diverse SOGI can access CHR in its capacity as gender ombud in investigating violations of the proposed measure?
Yes, Mr. President. At the outset, I certainly joined the good gentlewoman in her desire to pass into law also the CHR Charter Bill. I confirm that the intent of this bill is indeed to also provide redress mechanisms for SOGI-related cases for men. It is also consistent with the good gentlewoman's earlier intention to propose an amendment which will explicitly identify the rights holders, not limited to LGBTs alone, not limited to women alone, but also to include all individuals, including men of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And institutionally, Mr. President, we could contemplate that the inclusion of SOGI concerns, for example, in all PNP stations, could be through the expansion of the current women and children desks into, in fact, women, children, and gender rights protection desks.
That's good.
Open, yes, Mr. President, open to the approach of all individuals of whatever sexual orientation and gender identity and expression who might seek redress of grievances, their grievances. And this would all be in the spirit, Mr. President, of what is promised by the Gender and Development Act.
Thank you. And perhaps still on its role as gender ombud in relation to individuals with diverse sexual orientation, since there have been reported cases of murder and physical violence against LGBTs, perhaps we can consider tasking CHR to develop a database on breaches of human rights of LGBTs.
Yes, Mr. President. I would be very open to suggestions of the good gentlewoman how to further expand the formulation of the current Section 9 on redress mechanisms for SOGI-related cases, letter D, role of the Commission on Human Rights, the third paragraph, which provides, as of now, that the CHR shall also document cases of discrimination on the basis of SOGI and shall include these documented cases in its annual human rights report. And I would be very open to the idea expressed by the good gentlewoman that these would be included not only in the annual human rights reports, but in continuing, continuing database of the Commission.
Let's go, please, to the funding.
Yes.
The current legal basis for funding requirement on Gender and Development Plan is RA 7192, or the Women in Development and Nation Building. And we are aware that we now have the GAD budget. So would this proposed measure consider also tapping the GAD budget for programs under this proposed legislation?
Yes, Mr. President, that is what is contemplated by this bill, that the current GAD budget, in a sense, embrace not only what is commonly known now, that this should embrace women's rights and women's gender equality programs, but all individuals of various sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions. The the bill, particularly in Section 11, also contemplates the creation of a Congressional Oversight Committee, which will be referred to as the Anti-Discrimination Oversight Committee, which within 3 years after the enactment of this act will conduct an audit of national and local policies that discriminate on the basis of SOGI. Part of the oversight, or the audit rather, Mr. President, could be on how optimally and well the GAD budget has also been spent in order to promote gender sensitivity, gender equality, and eliminate discrimination as contemplated by this bill. And the Anti-Discrimination Oversight Committee is contemplated to exist 6 years after its organization. The hope expressed in this provision, in this section of the bill, is that within 6 years, we will have identified the best practices in terms of spending the GAD budget, also for the implementation of this bill and the achievement of its objectives, and that after 6 years, the spirit and the letter of this law will have been internalized and institutionalized in the different public and private institutions of our society.
Thank you, Mr. President. For my final query, how would the good sponsor, or how would the committee address or respond to the possible objections to this proposed measure on the basis of religion?
Yes. Yes, Mr. President. I am aware that there are concerns also, for example, about allegedly violating the right to religious freedom. And I would like to affirm that human rights protection does not negate the exercise of religious freedom. It was, in fact, Mr. President, CBCP President Archbishop Socrates Villegas himself who said that passing an anti-discrimination law is going to be a gesture of charity, or in the Christian language, a gesture of love. In the same statement he issued on 3rd March 2015, the Archbishop urged priests to care for all, including the LGBT community. He warned parents against imbuing in children hate against LGBTs, and he instructed Catholic schools specifically to implement a zero-tolerance policy against bullying, which the good gentlewoman raised earlier, against bullying of gender non-conforming students. So in that statement of the good Archbishop, he already, as if presages some of the measures contemplated by this bill to in terms of programs to promote non-discrimination and diversity. And lastly, discrimination, according to the Archbishop, he said, does not conform to Pope Francis's vision of the Church as the sacrament or the sign of divine mercy and compassion, to which Pope Francis dedicated the whole of year 2016 as the year of mercy. The Archbishop said it is contrary to the gospel spirit. Verbal and physical violence against LGBTs, the Archbishop said, is an offense against God himself. So these are statements direct from the leader of the Catholic Bishops' Conference in our country, which would demonstrate that the bill is not contradictory to, but on all of these counts, consistent with what the Catholic Church also preaches.
We actually do not see any objection from the Catholic Church, especially so that it is coming from the Pope Francis himself. Pope Francis has been assuring that transsexuals and homosexuals are accepted and embraced by the Catholic Church, but other religions would not have the same level of tolerance, and we should be able to respond and address any such objection that would be raised by any other religious sects because of the freedom of religion, although the good sponsor has so eloquently articulated on that aspect. So I thank the good sponsor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
her
Thank you very much to the
answers.
good
Thank you.
gentlewoman. Salamat po.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. There are other members who have scheduled interpellation, so I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1271 under Committee Report Number 17.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of Senate Bill number 1271 under Committee Report number 17 is hereby suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1304 under Committee Report Number 28.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, this is the proposed measure on Free Higher Education for All Act. Parliamentary status of the measure is that we're in the period of interpellation. I move to recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Education, Arts and Culture, Senator Bam Aquino, and scheduled to interpellate are Senators Hontiverus, Lacson, and Recto. Senator Hontiverus is withdrawing the schedule, so it will be Senator Lacson and Recto. So in the meantime, I move to suspend the session to allow Senator Aquino to join us in the session hall, Mr. President. Move to suspend.
Suspended.